He sat alone in the corner booth, untouched scotch warming beneath the low amber light. Yet his hand trembled as if the glass held something far heavier than liquor. The dining room around him hummed softly, forks clinking, quiet laughter drifting through the air, but none of it seemed to reach him. He stared through the window at nothing in particular, jaw tight, eyes unfocused, like a man carrying a weight no one else could see. Across the room, Elena Ward tightened her grip on a silver coffee pot. She had served difficult customers before, but something in the way the staff avoided his gaze, something in the hush that followed his name, made her chest grow strangely tight. Rain streaked down the window beside her, each drop blurring the world the way exhaustion sometimes blurred her thoughts. He was wealthy, powerful, untouchable, yet tonight, he looked like someone standing on the edge of a memory he couldn't escape, and he had asked for her. By name. If you've ever met someone whose anger was only the shadow of a deeper wound, this story might feel familiar. Let's begin. Rain streaked down the tall windows of Riverstone Grill, drifting in slow diagonal lines that caught the amber glow of the street lamps outside. Inside, the air was hushed in a way that felt unnatural for a Tuesday evening. Elena Ward stood just outside the private booth near the back, a silver coffee pot warming her palm. The handle slipped slightly as her fingers trembled. Grant Bellamy had asked for her by name. She heard the whispers the moment she stepped onto the floor. Servers dipping their heads together, voices lowered, eyes flicking toward the booth and then away again. The kitchen door swung open behind her, letting out a burst of heat and the clatter of pans. But even that noise seemed to dim as she forced herself to breathe slowly. She wiped her palm against her apron, as if that small gesture could steady the ache pulsing beneath her ribs. Elena was 38, but felt older tonight. Months of back-to-back shifts had carved fatigue into her bones. She had grown accustomed to ignoring the soreness in her feet and the sharp pinch between her shoulder blades. She needed the hours. She needed the tips. Her father's medical bills didn't bend to mercy. A server passed behind her, murmuring under his breath, "Good luck," though it sounded more like a warning than support. She didn't turn, didn't let herself look at anyone. Instead, she focused on the muted reflection in the window, her own face, pale under the soft lights, her hair braided back neatly, the faint circles under her eyes. She looked like a woman holding herself together with fraying thread. Ward. The floor manager spoke quietly behind her. "He's waiting." As if she could forget. Elena nodded once, lifted her chin, and stepped toward the booth. The private corner was framed by dark wood paneling and a curved leather banquette. A small lamp cast a cone of warm light over the table, but the man seated there sat just outside its reach. Grant Bellamy's silhouette was large, angled toward the window, his features edged by the cold blue wash of streetlight. He didn't turn when she approached. He didn't need to. His presence alone filled the space like a pressure system changing the weather. She forced her breath into something steady. "Good evening, Mr. Bellamy," she said, keeping her voice even. "Coffee, as requested." He didn't nod, didn't shift. She stepped closer, placing the pot gently on the table. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't acknowledge her at all. That she could have handled. Silence she understood. Then he looked up. His eyes were sharper, paler than she expected, like winter morning light skimming over ice. They held no warmth, no irritation, nothing she could place. Just a clear, cutting appraisal that made her feel as if the air had thinned between them. "You're late," he said. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Elena blinked once. She had arrived 3 minutes early. She had stood outside the booth for less than 10 seconds. She knew down to the beat of her pulse that she wasn't late. "I apologize if it seemed that way, sir," she said softly. It was the safest answer she could offer, the only answer the staff handbook would approve, but her voice betrayed something she hadn't intended, a thread of disbelief, slight but present. His gaze narrowed, as if he had heard it. She felt the heat rise along her neck, but kept her expression neutral. Her father's face flashed in her mind the way he tried to hide his discomfort. The way he insisted she shouldn't worry about him. But she did, every day, every hour. She couldn't afford to lose this job over pride. Still, pride flickered stubbornly in her chest. "I'll return with cream if you'd like," she added, shifting the weight of her stance to hide the tremor in her leg. He didn't answer. Instead, his gaze moved beyond her for a second, toward the hallway leading to the kitchen, then back to her face. Something unreadable passed through his eyes, too faint to name, too quick to understand. The silence stretched. She could feel it beginning to smother her. Her fingers curled slightly at her side, nails pressing into her palm. If she made even one mistake, a splash, a wrong word, a delayed refill, it could end the night badly. She'd heard the stories. Everyone had. How he had walked out on a meal because a server took too long with the check. How he had complained loud enough to get a hostess removed from the floor for offering him the wrong wine list. How he showed no hesitation in filing complaints that could cost people their jobs. He wasn't yelling now. He wasn't doing anything at all. Somehow, that was worse. Elena kept her voice low, steady. "Is there anything you need before I step away? Mr. Bellamy." His jaw shifted slightly, as if he'd heard something in her tone, fear, perhaps, or the stubbornness she hadn't quite managed to bury. For the first time, he looked directly at the coffee pot she had placed before him, though his hand didn't reach for it. "Stay," he said. The single word held no explanation, no emotion, just command. She stayed. She felt each second press against her, felt her throat tighten. The hum of the dining room faded to a distant murmur. Rain tapped lightly against the window beside him, streaking the glass with thin silver lines. He didn't speak again. She stood in the dim glow, unsure what it was he wanted: service, silence, obedience, or something else entirely. The weight of his attention bore down on her, making the edges of the room blur slightly. Why had he asked for her? Why tonight? As she held her posture, trying to slow her breathing, another thought settled in, sharp enough to make her pulse jump. If he lied about her being late, if he started with a lie, what else did he plan to twist before the night was over? The question clung to her ribs like a hook she couldn't remove. She waited for his next move, knowing it could decide far more than her shift. Knowing something about this night was different. Knowing he wouldn't have summoned her without a reason she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. Elena's life had not unraveled overnight. It had frayed slowly, thread by thread, until she could hardly remember what it felt like to move through a day without calculating the next bill. That first week at Riverstone Grill felt like a lifetime ago now. Yet the memory rose in her mind with startling clarity as she stood in the dim hallway. The ghost of Grant Bellamy's cold gaze still clinging to the back of her neck. Back then, she had walked through the restaurant's bright glass doors with the timid hope of someone who needed the job more than she dared admit. The manager had handed her a crisp apron and a training packet thick enough to rival a college textbook. She remembered smoothing the apron across her waist, telling herself she was ready. She wasn't. No one ever was for a place like Riverstone. That week had been a blur of polished silverware and choreographed movements, 7 types of forks, 5 types of glasses, each requiring placement with near military precision. She memorized wine profiles late into the night, whispering notes of oak and berry under her breath as she folded laundry at home. Her trainer, a woman with neatly pinned hair and a voice steady as a metronome, kept repeating the same mantra: professional, invisible, perfect. And then just once her trainer had paused, lowered her voice, and added, "And whatever you do, avoid table 15 on Tuesdays. That's Mr. Bellamy's booth." Elena had been too new to ask questions. She simply nodded, filed the rule alongside dozens of others, and followed the unspoken understanding that hung in the air like static. Staff moved differently on Tuesdays, more carefully, as though the floorboards themselves might crack under the wrong footstep. She hadn't understood why. Not then. At the end of each shift, she drove home down Maple Ridge Road, hands stiff on the wheel, mind still echoing with reservation numbers and allergy notes. The house was always dark when she arrived, save for the warm glow from her father's bedroom. She would push the door open quietly, seeing the soft rise and fall of his chest beneath the thin blanket, the steady hum of the oxygen machine perched beside his bed. The sound had terrified her at first, but now it blended into her life the way a river blends into the landscape, constant, unignorable. Her younger sister, Rachel, often sat at the kitchen table sorting envelopes into small piles. Medical invoices, insurance statements, overdue notices. She would glance up when Elena walked in, forcing a calm smile, even though worry creased her forehead. Long night, Rachel would ask softly. Just normal. Elena would answer, setting her keys in the chipped bowl by the sink. Normal. The word had become a shield, a lie, and a lifeline all at once. Most nights, she stayed awake long after Rachel went to bed. Sometimes she sat by her father's side, adjusting his blanket, listening to the hollow wheeze of the machine. Other times, she stood alone by the window, looking out across the quiet street, wondering how a life once filled with laughter and plans had narrowed into nothing but shifts, bills, and exhaustion. Still, she pressed on. She always pressed on. During her second week at Riverstone, she finally saw him. She had been carrying a tray of water glasses, trying to move silently between tables. The dining room was crowded, every chair filled, the buzz of conversation rising in gentle waves. She turned a corner and nearly collided with a sharply dressed man standing outside the private booth. She froze, the tray steadied in her hands by sheer instinct. He didn't move aside. He didn't apologize. Instead, he lifted his gaze to hers with slow precision, as though deciding whether she was worth acknowledging. Grant Bellamy. The name hadn't meant much until that moment. His eyes were the first thing she noticed, pale and cool, like daylight reflecting off ice. He held her stare longer than felt appropriate, longer than felt safe. She sensed the room shift around them, somewhere behind her. A server sucked in a breath. Another stopped mid-step. She should have looked away. Everyone knew that. But something in her, some small, stubborn corner, tired of feeling unseen, tightened, and she held his gaze. Just for a second, just enough. His brow twitched, a faint ripple of something she couldn't read. Then he stepped around her without a word, the faint trace of cedar and cold air trailing behind him. The tray felt heavier when he was gone. When she returned to the server's station, one of her co-workers stared at her wide-eyed. "You shouldn't have done that," he whispered. "Done what she asked, looked at him like that." She shrugged, though her heart still thumped too fast. It was just eye contact, not with him, never with him. The rule she once thought was just an exaggeration suddenly felt real. Real in a way that prickled her skin. That moment replayed itself now, as she walked across the floor toward the hallway, the coffee pot still warm against her palm. She wondered if that brief accidental encounter was the seed of whatever tonight was becoming. She wondered if he remembered it. She wondered why a man with that much icy self-control had paused at all. Her thoughts drifted back to her father as she reached the edge of the hallway. She pictured the soft lines of his face, the way he smiled weakly whenever she walked in after a shift, saying, "You're working too hard, sweetheart." She smiled back every time, pretending she didn't hear the fear under his words. The guilt pressed into her chest now, the guilt of leaving him for hours every day, of relying on Rachel to shoulder more than she should, of missing dinners and small moments because she could not afford to stop. She leaned briefly against the wall, breathing in slowly, trying to steady the tremor in her hand. She needed this job. She needed this income. But she also needed to survive nights like this one, when Grant Bellamy's presence pressed into her life with suffocating weight. When she stepped back onto the floor that night, she first met his eyes. The dining room had gone eerily quiet for just a heartbeat. Servers watching her, exchanging looks that mixed fear with curiosity. Something had happened in that moment. She didn't know what. She didn't know why. But the memory of his unblinking gaze lingered now, years later, as though it marked a beginning she hadn't understood at the time. And tonight, he had asked for her. Directly, By name? She couldn't shake the feeling that the moment she held his stare had mattered to him, somehow mattered enough that he remembered her, singled her out, and waited for her to walk toward him again. But why her why, now? The question followed her like a shadow she could not outrun. The first request he made wasn't hard. It was the 10 that followed. Elena stood beside the booth with her notepad balanced against her palm, the warm light barely touching her face while Grant Bellamy remained fixed in the colder wash from the rain-soaked window. He didn't glance up when he spoke. Each instruction was delivered as though he were dictating to an invisible assistant. "I'd like the roast chicken," he said, "but not the roasted vegetables. Replace them with green beans, not sautéed, steamed, and only if they remain bright in color." Before she could respond, he added, "No herbs on the chicken, no glaze. Do not plate anything touching." She wrote steadily, her pen moving with the same measured rhythm as her breathing. Her pulse, however, pounded irregularly. Then came the next order. "For water, bring a bottle unopened, I'll pour it myself. And a glass without ice. No lemon, ice on a separate plate." Her pen paused only half a second before continuing. The third request followed, "And the bread," he said, lightly warmed. "Not toasted. If the crust cracks when I press it, I'll send it back." A muscle tightened in her jaw. She forced it to relax. She couldn't let anything show. She needed this job, the paycheck that would cover only part of her father's newest medication cycle, the insurance call she still needed to return. Survival tugged at her spine like a wire pulled too tight. As she wrote, she felt the prickling sensation of being watched. She didn't turn, but she knew the staff's eyes were on her. They hovered near the edge of the dining room, pretending to polish glasses, pretending to check the table numbers. Everyone knew he was pushing, testing, and everyone knew how easily one mistake could turn into a story whispered for months. She finished writing. "I'll take care of that for you," she said, her voice steady. Only then did he look at her. His pale eyes flicked to her hand, as if measuring the stillness of her grip, then to her face. For a second so faint she nearly doubted it. She thought he might smirk, but the expression vanished before she could be sure. When she walked away, she could almost feel the room breathe again. In the kitchen, she relayed the order to the chef, who blinked twice, then let out a slow whistle. "Does he ever just order off the menu?" he muttered. Elena offered a small, apologetic shrug. She had no explanation that didn't feel like betrayal of someone she didn't even like. Back on the floor, the tension settled around her shoulders like a weight. She moved with precision, checking glassware, making sure nothing smudged, nothing slipped. She reminded herself to stand straight. Small details mattered. When she returned to the table with the water arrangement, he inspected each item with maddening slowness. The unopened bottle, the empty glass, the plate of ice. Only after a long pause did he give the slightest nod, permitting her to leave. 3 minutes later, he asked for a different glass. She brought one, then a napkin folded a certain way. She brought that. Then he asked her to move the lamp on the table half an inch toward the wall. She did, her fingers steady even though something hot burned low in her throat. She could feel the irritation rising, a dull, simmering ache beneath her ribs. But right beside it, braided tightly with it, was fear. The fear of losing hours, losing tips, losing the one job flexible enough to let her take her father to appointments when Rachel couldn't. The one job that kept them afloat, barely, but still afloat. Dignity versus survival. She swallowed both and kept going. When the chicken order arrived, it looked perfect. The chef had done everything exactly as instructed. Green beans bright and arranged carefully apart from the chicken. Seasoning minimal, nothing touching. Elena set the plate before him with care. "Your meal, sir." He didn't look at her, not at first. He picked up his fork, pressed lightly against the chicken, then swept his eyes across the plate. No frown, no complaint, no comment. He lifted the fork halfway and paused. Then he set it down. "Take it back," he said. Elena blinked once, unsure she heard him correctly. "Is something wrong, sir?" "It's not appetizing," he said simply. "Return it." The plate was untouched, pristine. A sharp heat surged up her chest, but she kept her face neutral. She lifted the plate, turning carefully so nothing spilled. Not that anything could with the staff's stares heavy on her back. In the kitchen, the chef's eyebrows shot up. "What did he say?" "Nothing," she answered, "just that it wasn't appetizing." The chef let out a slow exhale, gripping the counter. "I swear that man, Elena," the manager's voice cut in, sharp. "Just bring him something else. Same order." She nodded. No protests, no time to think. She moved quickly, carrying the rejected plate away before the irritation in her chest curled further. As she waited for the replacement dish, she leaned briefly against the cool metal counter, eyes closing for a heartbeat. Something about tonight was sharper. He wasn't angry. He wasn't speaking loudly. But every request carried an edge that dug under the skin. Every precise instruction felt like it was designed to see what she could endure. When she returned with the second plate, he looked at her, not at the food, not at the placement, but at her before letting his gaze drop back to the table. Something flickered there again, subtle, deliberate. She set the plate down gently. "If there's anything else you need," he interrupted her. "There will be." She stepped back, pulse tight. He hadn't asked for something else. He had promised it. And she couldn't shake the question that pressed against her chest as she moved away. Her steps too careful, her breath too slow. What exactly was he trying to provoke? Every server before her had broken. Elena didn't. It struck her as strange how still the dining room felt when she approached the booth again. The rain had eased outside, leaving faint streaks on the windows. But inside, the air held a different tension, something sharper. She carried a fresh set of utensils and a linen napkin. Her fingers steady in a way her heartbeat wasn't. Grant Bellamy didn't look up right away. He kept his gaze on a document laid flat beside his plate, his pen tapping once lightly, rhythmically, almost bored. When he finally lifted his eyes, there was no greeting, not even the polite nod he sometimes offered the staff he tolerated. Instead, he glanced at the utensils in her hand and said, "Is that the best you can manage?" The words were quiet, almost casual, but they cut with the precision of a blade. Elena stopped, not abruptly, just enough that her breath caught before she forced it into something steady. She placed the utensils down with care, aligning them precisely along the edge of the folded napkin. Her silence didn't seem to deter him. "I asked for polished silver," he continued, examining the fork as though it offended him. "This looks rushed." She knew it didn't. She had polished each piece herself, checked them under the kitchen lights, wiped away even fingerprints that weren't visible from a distance. Still, she kept her expression neutral. "I can bring another set if you'd like," she said softly. "I'd like you to do it properly," he replied, leaning back slightly. "Unless this is the extent of your ability." A ripple moved through the dining room. Chairs didn't creak, conversations didn't halt abruptly, but something in the energy shifted. The servers at nearby tables stood a little straighter, movements slowing as though they were afraid to draw any attention. Elena felt heat rise beneath her collar, a slow burn pressing upward toward her throat. She pictured her father's face, the way he tightened his jaw when pain flared, refusing to show weakness. She pictured the bottles of medication lined up on the kitchen shelf, 3 nearly empty. 2. They hadn't been able to refill yet. She could bow, she could nod, apologize, retrieve another set of silverware, and swallow the sting the way she always did. But something in her, something worn thin after months of exhaustion, held firm. "This set is polished," she said quietly. "But if you prefer a different one, I'll bring it." Her tone was respectful, but there was something beneath it, a spine, a boundary, a refusal to disappear. Grant's pen stopped tapping. For the first time that evening, he gave her his full attention. His gaze moved across her face, studying the calm she was working so hard to maintain. His expression didn't shift immediately, but she sensed the change, the faint, unexpected pause. "You're certain," he said, his voice like cool stone. She nodded once. Yes, sir. A hush swept across the nearby tables. She felt the weight of the room behind her, the servers holding their breath, the manager hovering near the corner with a tight jaw, everyone waiting for the break for the snap. Grant lifted the fork again, turning it between his fingers, searching for the flaw he'd accused her of. His face remained unreadable, but she could see the smallest flicker in his eyes. Surprise, not irritation, not anger, surprise, then something else, harder to place, something she couldn't name if she tried. Interesting, he murmured, setting the fork down with deliberate precision. Most here don't contradict me. She didn't answer. She knew better than to fill the silence. Instead, she met his gaze steadily, the same way she had the first accidental encounter months ago. Not challenging him, not shrinking either, just standing her ground. The moment stretched, taut as a wire pulled between them. Then he leaned back slightly, studying her with a focus that unsettled her more than his criticism had. It felt like he was searching for something, testing for something, and hadn't expected her to pass. "Bring me tea," he said finally. "Black. No sugar?" She exhaled quietly, turning to leave. Her footsteps felt too loud, too heavy. Even though she moved lightly, she could sense the staff's eyes following her, could hear the unspoken questions rattling in the silence. In the kitchen, the chef glanced up from the stovetop. "You okay?" She nodded, placing her hands briefly on the counter to steady them. He wanted tea. "That's it?" the chef asked. "That's it," she said, though her throat felt tight, but it wasn't it. Not really. Something had shifted at that table. By the time she returned with the tea, Grant had moved the document aside and folded his hands neatly on the table. He watched her set the cup down, watched the faint curl of steam rise between them. When she stepped back, he said, "You didn't apologize. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, the kind that made her pulse jump." "No, sir," she answered gently. "I didn't." The corners of his mouth didn't move, but something in his eyes did. A subtle shift that unsettled her more than anger would have. "You may go," he said. She turned, her hands clasping behind her apron to hide the tremor returning to her fingers. As she walked away from the booth, a question pressed into her chest. Heavier than the tea tray she carried? Had she won something in that exchange? Or had she just stepped onto ground she shouldn't have dared to touch? People spoke his name like a warning, but that wasn't the whole story. Elena realized that as soon as she stepped into the staff lounge after her brief confrontation with Grant, the room smelled faintly of brewed coffee and lemon cleaner, and a single fluorescent light flickered above, casting a pale glow across the metal lockers. Two servers stood near the counter, whispering. When they saw her, they didn't scatter the way they usually did when the subject of their gossip walked in. Instead, they exchanged a hesitant glance, as though deciding who should speak first. "You handled him better than most." One of them murmured. It wasn't praise, exactly more like acknowledgement of a strange, quiet milestone. "I just did my job," Elena said, though a knot still tightened under her ribs. The second server, Mark, a man in his early 60s with kind eyes, closed his locker slowly. "You should know something," he said gently. "About him." Elena hesitated. She wasn't sure she wanted more stories, more warnings, more whispered accounts of Grant's temper or impossible standards. But Mark's expression held no mockery, no fear, only an earnest seriousness she hadn't expected. "He wasn't always like this," Mark continued. "Not even close." Another server approached a woman with silver streaks in her hair and a softness in her voice. "He used to come here with his family," she added, "almost every weekend. His wife loved the pear tart we used to serve." Elena blinked. "Family?" The woman nodded. "A beautiful little boy, 5 years old, always carried a stuffed bear." A stillness settled over Elena, a different kind of heaviness than before. She listened without interrupting. "It was a DUI, Mark said quietly. "Hit and run. His wife died instantly." The boy didn't make it through the night. The words hung in the room like a dimming light. Elena felt her breath slip, caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. She imagined a child's laughter echoing through the dining room, a woman's gentle smile, a family sharing small joys. She imagined the sudden wrenching loss, the kind that tears a life into a before and after. How long ago, she asked. 7 years, Mark replied. Feels like yesterday for him, I think. And the driver, she whispered. A bitter shadow crossed the woman's face. Barely got anything. Minimal sentence. Some technicality in the case. Walked free sooner than anyone expected. The silence that followed was heavy, pulsing with unspoken judgment. Grant changed after that, Mark said. Everything hardened in him, like he decided nothing soft was worth keeping. Elena leaned back against the cool metal of the lockers, the breath leaving her slowly. She had seen grief take many shapes, quiet resignation, trembling sorrow, simmering anger, but this, the grief that turned into steel, that calcified into something punishing and cold, she had never understood it from the inside, only observed it in glimpses, in the eyes of customers who carried invisible weight. And now she saw it in Grant. He used to laugh, the woman added softly. He used to tip big. He used to listen when we talked to him. He knew our names. Elena frowned slightly. He doesn't even look at us now. It hurts too much, Mark said. I think everything hurts too much. She didn't know what to do with that. Compassion tugged at her, soft and steady, asking to be acknowledged, but irritation still pulsed beneath it. Irritation at the way he wielded his pain like a weapon, cutting down anyone who came too close. She pressed a hand against her apron, feeling the faint imprint of the folded napkin she'd tucked inside earlier. He still shouldn't treat people like that, she said quietly. No, Mark agreed. But some people lose themselves for a while. Some lose themselves for good. The woman sighed. We don't know which one he is. A hush filled the space again, the kind that doesn't require words, only understanding. After a long moment, Elena stepped toward the break room counter, where an old corkboard hung cluttered with schedules, announcements, and fading photographs from staff gatherings long past. She wasn't sure what drew her attention, but when she leaned closer, she saw it. A small photo tucked near the edge, half covered by a holiday schedule. A picture of the dining room from years ago, bright, crowded, warm, and in the corner, holding a little boy on his lap, was a younger version of Grant. He wasn't smiling politely. He was smiling fully, cheeks lifted, eyes bright. Laughter caught mid-moment. His son. A child with sandy hair and a grin wide enough to show missing baby teeth, held a small stuffed bear in both hands. His wife leaned against Grant's shoulder, her expression tender and relaxed. For a heartbeat. Elena forgot the cold man sitting in the private booth tonight. She forgot the demands, the sharp comments, the impossible expectations. She saw instead a man who once held joy without hesitation, a man whose world had been shattered in an instant. A wave of empathy rose in her chest, slow, heavy, impossible to ignore. She reached out and touched the edge of the photo lightly, almost reverently. Her fingers stilled on the worn paper. It felt fragile, like a relic of something that no longer existed. Be careful, the woman whispered. If he sees anyone looking at that picture, he loses it. Elena withdrew her hand. Why is it still here? No one has the heart to take it down. A quiet sadness settled over her shoulders. She took a slow breath, preparing herself to return to the floor, to face the man who carried all this loss beneath a coat of ice. As she stepped toward the door, one question rose, unbidden and uneasy, catching her just as she reached for the handle. Was she serving a monster tonight, or a man drowning so quietly that no one could hear him anymore? The next week, he returned, and this time, he asked for her before he ordered. Elena heard his name whispered across the dining room long before she saw him. Tuesday evenings always carried a certain tightness in the air, but tonight it felt sharper, more electric. She had just tied her apron when the floor manager stepped toward her with an expression that fell somewhere between disbelief and caution. "He's here," he murmured, "and he asked for you." Elena's breath caught. Before he sat down, before the host even showed him to the booth, she didn't know what to do with that. A flicker of unease slid down her spine, sharp enough to slow her steps as she approached the private corner. The booth lights were dimmer tonight, casting Grant Bellamy in a more muted shadow. He sat alone, his posture impeccable, the collar of his coat still crisp from the cold outside. He wasn't looking at the menu. He wasn't checking his phone. He was waiting. For her. The moment she approached, his gaze lifted not cold, not irritated, but searching. "Good evening, Mr. Bellamy," she said quietly, hands folded before her. "How may I assist you?" He didn't answer right away. He studied her as though comparing this version of her to the memory he held. There was something unsettling in the calmness of his eyes, not the sharp, punishing glint she had seen before, but something smoother, almost contemplative. "Water," he said finally, his voice even. "Room temperature, no ice." It was the simplest request he had ever given her. She blinked once, unsure whether this was the opening to a storm or a genuine shift. Of course. When she left to retrieve the water, she could feel the staff's eyes on her again this time, not with pity or dread, but open-mouthed confusion. One of the newer servers mouthed, "Why you?" She had no answer to give. She returned with the water, placing the bottle and glass carefully in front of him. He watched her movements not to inspect, not to criticize, but with a strangely attentive focus that unnerved her. He said, "You look tired." The comment was so unexpected she nearly dropped the bottle. "I'm fine," she managed. "Are you?" His brows lowered slightly, not in anger, but in something that looked dangerously close to concern. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't sure she liked it. He straightened his posture, as though realizing he had stepped closer than intended. "The menu," he said, shifting back to formality. "I'd like recommendations." Another surprise. Grant Bellamy didn't do recommendations. Grant ordered like a man who'd memorized every flaw in the world and intended to correct them one by one. Yet tonight, he waited for her answer without impatience. She cleared her throat. "The cedar-grilled salmon is popular, light, not heavily seasoned. The chef prepares it consistently well." He held her gaze a beat longer than felt comfortable. Then that. No modifications, no elaborate instructions, just that. As she walked back to the kitchen, she could feel her heart knocking lightly inside her chest. Was this manipulation a game, or had something in him, however small, begun to shift? The night unfolded in a series of tests, but not the kind she was used to. He wasn't cruel, wasn't cutting. Instead, he watched, observed, like he was examining not her mistakes, but her steadiness. At one point, he asked for hot tea, then changed his mind and asked for coffee, then set the cup aside without touching it, not demands measurements. When she refilled his water, his voice brushed the space between them. "You didn't hesitate." To refill the glass, she asked, confused, to come back. She didn't know how to answer that. She didn't know what he expected. He leaned back in the booth. "Most people avoid me." She kept her voice gentle. "They're not sure how to approach you." "And you are?" he asked. Her breath thinned. She wasn't sure what she was, or what he wanted her to be. The loss she learned about last week tugged at her conscience, softening edges she once held sharp. But she wouldn't lie, not to him, not to herself. "I try to do my job well," she said quietly, "no matter who I'm serving." His eyes flickered briefly, faintly, like a memory passing through. For a moment, she thought he might ask another question, but instead, he lifted the glass of water and took a small sip. The action was nothing simple. Mundane, yet something about it made her pause. She had never seen him drink water before, not once. His drink of choice was always Scotch-aged, expensive, poured with ritual precision. Tonight, he didn't order any. When the meal arrived, he ate slowly, without comment, no criticism, no demands for replacements. When he finished, He pushed the plate aside with an unreadable expression, his jaw tightening once, as though tasting something far away from the food itself. She stepped toward him gently. "Can I get you anything else for a long moment?" He didn't speak. Then he returned the question to her, just as quiet. "Do you think I need something else?" The words sat between them, cool and unsettling. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She didn't know what he was asking. Not really. But when she looked at him, she saw the faintest exhaustion beneath the polished exterior, a weariness that didn't come from hunger or thirst. He lifted the water glass again, running a thumb along the rim before taking another deliberate sip. That was the moment she realized it. This wasn't punishment, and it wasn't about control. Something in him had changed. She stepped back, her pulse tightening slightly, unsure if the shift made him more predictable or far less. As she walked away, one thought followed her down the dim hallway like a shadow she couldn't shake. What changed in him, and why did it begin with her? Her phone buzzed. Her sister never called during a shift. Elena froze for half a second, the vibration rattling faintly against the counter where she had set it down. The dining room behind her murmured with low conversations and clinking glasses, but the sound faded as dread crept up her spine. Rachel knew her schedule by heart. She wouldn't call unless something was wrong. She murmured a quick apology to a passing server, slipped into the narrow hallway near the service station, and answered in a whisper. "Rach." "What's going on?" Her sister's voice came through tight and breathless. "Elena, I just talked to the specialist." Elena's hand braced against the wall. The cool tile steadied her for a second. "Tell me." "They want to start Dad on the new treatment, the one the doctor mentioned last month." "That's good," Elena said, trying to cling to hope. "Right. That means he's still a candidate." "Yes," Rachel said. Then the pause came long, trembling. "But it's not covered by insurance." Elena shut her eyes. "How much? 38,000, Rachel whispered. Up front, the number hit like a blunt punch. Elena's breath left her chest in a thin, uneven rush. She pressed her forehead to the wall, feeling the cold seep into her skin. "Okay," she said, though the word cracked. "Okay, we'll figure it out." "Elena, we will," she insisted, but her voice betrayed her. A wobble, a shiver. "Dad can't wait. We'll find a way." She tried to breathe steadily, but her lungs refused to cooperate. Her shift already stretched long behind her, and the weight of the dining room, the hours, the exhaustion, it all pressed down harder with that one impossible number. "Elena, I'm so sorry," Rachel whispered. "No, don't be," Elena said quickly, wiping the corner of her eye with her apron. "Just don't tell Dad yet. He'll shut down the whole idea if he knows the cost." "I won't," Rachel promised. But Elena, we're out of time. A small, fragile sound escaped her half sigh, half sob. "I know." She hung up quietly, letting her hand fall to her side. For a moment, the hallway blurred, the oxygen machine at home, the overdue bills on the kitchen counter, her father's thin smile when he tried to pretend he wasn't in pain, and her own body, tired down to the bone, still trying to hold everything together. She straightened, swallowing hard, forcing her breathing back into some kind of order. She couldn't fall apart here, not on shift, not where everyone could. She turned and froze. Grant Bellamy stood 3 steps behind her. He wasn't supposed to be there. He never left his booth until the check was signed. He avoided the restrooms, the service area, any part of the restaurant that involved proximity to other people. Yet here he was. He must have heard everything. The dim overhead lights carved stark shadows across his face, deepening the harsh line of his jaw. But his posture, that was what struck her. Rigid, still, not in anger, but in something heavier, darker. His hands hung at his sides, not clenched, but held as though he didn't quite trust them to stay steady. Elena's stomach twisted. Shame surged hot through her chest. Her voice evaporated. She cleared her throat and tried again. Softer this time. "I'm sorry. I just needed a moment. I'll return to your table." He didn't answer. He didn't move. The silence stretched past tolerable into something close to unbearable. She felt exposed, as though he had walked into the middle of her grief and turned on a spotlight. The one person she least wanted to hear that conversation had heard every word. She straightened her apron, trying to restore some sense of control to her hands. "I didn't mean to disrupt your evening, Mr. Bellamy." For a breath. He didn't look at her. He looked at the wall just past her shoulder, as if focusing on a point that steadied him. His throat worked once in a tight swallow. Then, finally, his gaze lifted to meet hers. There was no coldness, no superiority, no edge, only something that shouldn't have been possible on his face, something almost human, almost pained. He didn't speak, not a single word, but the look alone made her chest tighten. He turned away abruptly, as though afraid the moment might stretch longer and reveal more than he wanted. His shoulders were drawn high, rigid beneath his tailored coat, and for the first time since she'd met him, his stride wasn't perfectly controlled. He walked back toward his booth with the faintest hint of hesitation. Elena pressed her palm to her mouth, steadying herself. The humiliation burned hot and raw. Her private world held together by duct tape and hope now lay cracked open in front of the one man who could make her life harder with the smallest motion. She forced herself to follow him, each step deliberate despite the quake inside her chest. When she reached the booth, he had already taken his seat, staring out the window with an expression she couldn't decipher. Her voice barely rose above a murmur. "Would you like your check now, sir?" Another moment of silence, thick, weighted. "No," he said quietly. It wasn't the flat refusal she expected. The tone was different, lower, almost rough. She didn't know what to do with that. She stood in respectful distance, waiting for him to ask for something, anything that would reestablish the roles they were used to. But he remained motionless, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the glass. Elena's heart beat unevenly in her ribs. She had no idea what he was thinking, no way to read the shift in his posture. All she knew was that something had changed, and she didn't know whether that terrified her or gave her a strange, flickering hope. As she stepped back from the booth, the question clung to her, sharp and quiet. What would a man like Grant Bellamy do with the knowledge of her desperation? The call came 2 days later, from an area code she had only seen on lawyer ads. Elena almost didn't answer. She was standing in the small break room at the clinic where she had taken her father for a checkup that morning, rubbing warmth into her cold fingers while he slept in a chair nearby. Spam calls were nothing new, but something in her, some odd, restless instinct, made her swipe the screen. "Ms. Ward," a crisp voice asked. "This is Harper and Winslow, attorneys at law. We're calling regarding your father, David Ward." Elena's spine straightened. Her grip tightened around the phone. Harper and Winslow wasn't a small-town practice. Their ads ran during national news hours. Just hearing the name made her pulse stumble. I'm sorry," she said carefully. "I didn't reach out to any lawyers." "You didn't have to," the woman replied. "Your case has been taken on pro bono, full legal support." Immediate review. Your father's insurance denial appears to have been mishandled. Elena blinked at the coffee machine in front of her, its blinking light smearing through the blur of her shock. Pro bono? That can't be right. "We never applied, Ms. Ward." The voice interrupted gently. "An anonymous benefactor has retained us on your behalf. All fees are covered. The firm has already submitted an appeal to your father's insurance provider." It felt as though the room turned quieter, as if even the vending machine hush-hummed more softly. Elena swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "There must be a mistake," she said, though the words came faint and weak. "No mistake. The appeal may take some time, but we're optimistic. This treatment should qualify." Her knees softened beneath her. She pressed her free hand to the counter to steady herself. "And this benefactor?" she whispered. They didn't leave a name. A message? "No, ma'am. Only instructions. Move the process quickly. Oh, we'll stay in touch." The call ended before she could ask anything else. She stood there for a long moment, the silence thick around her, the hum of fluorescent lights, the soft click of the heating vent, her father's slow, uneven breathing from the chair behind her. Her heartbeat felt loud enough to echo, "Anonymous benefactor, full legal support, a firm that charged more per hour than she made in a week." She turned slowly toward her father, his head rested against the thin cushion, his chest lifting gently beneath the faded blue jacket he insisted on wearing even indoors. Tubes whispered against the oxygen tank at his feet. His face lined, tired, looked impossibly small. Her eyes stung. For months, she had lived inside a tightening circle, every step measured, every bill a new cliff edge. She had stretched herself thin across shifts, tears, hope that burned to embers. And now, without warning, a rope had dropped into the dark. But hope, she knew, was dangerous. Hope could turn on you. She sank onto the chair beside her father and rested her forehead in her palms. Why would anyone do this? And then the answer, quiet, unwelcome, inevitable, rose from the back of her mind. Only one person knew about the $38,000. She exhaled shakily. A memory surfaced: Grant, standing behind her in the hallway at the restaurant, his face shadowed, his body rigid, his silence almost unbearably heavy. She had spent 2 days trying to forget the look in his eyes, an expression that didn't fit the man she thought he was. She had written it off as pity, or shock, or disapproval. Now she wasn't sure anymore. Her father stirred beside her. She lifted her head, blinking her thoughts away just as he opened his eyes. "You all right, sweetheart?" he murmured. She nodded quickly, smoothing her expression. "Just tired, Dad. The doctor will call soon." He studied her for a moment. He always saw more than she wanted him to. But before he could ask anything else, a nurse entered with forms, giving her an excuse to stand and collect herself. She followed the nurse to the counter, but her mind stayed fixed on the phone call. The firm's name, the impossible generosity, anonymous benefactor. But it wasn't anonymous at all. Was it? Not really. On the drive home later, her father slept in the passenger seat. The late afternoon sun angled through the windshield, washing everything in a gold that felt too warm for the storm brewing in her chest. She glanced at him, his thinning hair, his soft snoring, the way he clutched his jacket like a security blanket. She would do anything for him, anything. But what if someone else had decided to help her? Someone she didn't trust, someone who had spent weeks testing her patience, pushing her limits, staring at her with an intensity she couldn't decipher. Grant Bellamy was not a man who did things out of kindness. That much everyone agreed on. So, why this "at home"? Her sister greeted them at the door, worry etched in every line of her face. Elena pulled her aside, telling her only the bare minimum, that a law firm believed the denial could be overturned. She didn't mention money, didn't mention anything being paid for, didn't say the word benefactor, not until she understood it herself. Later, when her father slept again, she stepped onto the back porch. Evening had settled over the yard, the sky folding into soft blues and faint purples. The air carried the smell of pine and the hint of coming frost. She wrapped her arms around herself. Her phone was hot in her pocket. She took it out, stared at it. The truth pressed harder with every breath. Only one person had heard enough to know the number. Only one man had watched her break in the hallway. Only one man had the resources, the influence, the reason, whatever reason it might be, to intervene so completely. She inhaled shakily. "Why you?" she whispered into the quiet yard. Why would a man like him help her? She didn't know the answer, but she felt the weight of the question settle over her like a second skin, and she knew it wasn't done with her yet. Elena didn't set out to investigate him, but the truth kept finding her. It began with a restless night. She lay awake long after her father and sister had fallen asleep. the house quiet except for the steady hum of the old refrigerator downstairs. She stared at the ceiling, watching the faint shadows of tree branches sway in the window's reflection, and felt the lingering tug of the phone call she'd received earlier that day. She should have been relieved. She should have felt a weight lift, even just a little. But instead, she felt unsettled, held between gratitude and fear, unable to shake the image of Grant standing behind her in the hallway, his face shadowed by something raw and unguarded. Just before midnight, she slipped out of bed, wrapped herself in a sweater, and padded quietly to the small kitchen table. Her old laptop sat there among unopened mail and a half-empty jar of tea. She opened it slowly, the screen's glow washing over her tired face. She typed his name, Grant Bellamy. The search results were predictable at first: business articles, investment profiles, pictures of him at fundraisers with a tight-lipped smile and a posture too stiff to seem natural. She scrolled slowly, trying to decide what she hoped to find. Maybe proof that she was wrong, or proof that she wasn't. Then something odd caught her eye. A foundation name she didn't recognize: Bellamy Restoration Initiative. No photo, no public ties to him, just a list of grants awarded to victims of violent crimes, families navigating wrongful death cases, survivors of drunk driving accidents. Her cursor hovered. She clicked. The website was bare bones, quiet, almost intentionally forgettable. Donations marked simply as private patron, but buried in the PDF reports. She noticed a pattern: small comments in the margins from past directors, reference codes matching Bellamy Enterprises, addresses aligning with properties he owned. Her pulse fluttered. She opened another tab, searching deeper. It took time, long, tedious hours trailing through old news articles and non-profit databases, but the pattern appeared again, and again, and again. A scholarship fund for children who lost a parent in DUI incidents. A legal aid group dedicated to challenging insurance denials and medical emergencies. A victim advocacy hotline paid for through anonymous contribution. Every path circled back to him, not publicly, not proudly, quietly, secretly, as if he couldn't bear to be thanked. Elena leaned back, fingers pressed to her lips. She thought about the rumors at the restaurant, the cruelty, the coldness, the short temper. She thought about the way he watched her with that mix of scrutiny and something else she hadn't understood. Maybe it wasn't superiority. Maybe it was recognition, like he was looking at someone living inside the same kind of pain. Yet, he did all of this in the dark. Why hide it? She clicked open another archived link, one she hadn't expected to find. It was an old local newspaper article, dated 10 years before. The image loaded slowly on her screen. A family photo. Grant, younger, his hair longer, his face softer. His arm rested around a woman, her blue sundress fluttering in the wind. In front of them stood a boy, maybe 5, grinning with missing baby teeth. Elena felt her breath slip out in a quiet exhale. She had heard the story from co-workers, but seeing the 3 of them together, it was different. It turned rumor into something painfully real. Grant wasn't smiling big, just a small, genuine curve of his mouth, the kind of smile you made for no one but the person holding your world beside you. She zoomed in slightly, his hand on his son's shoulder, the easy tilt of his wife's head against him, the warmth around them, sunlight catching in their hair. It was impossible not to see the love there, and equally impossible not to see what he had lost. She swallowed, her chest tightened with a slow, aching pull. For months, she had thought of him as a storm, something cold and sharp that pressed down on everyone around him. But sitting there in the dim kitchen light, she saw the outline of something else entirely. A man who had been hollowed out and left to walk through the world with pieces of himself missing. She glanced at the clock. 1:30. She should go to bed. She had an early shift, but her hands wouldn't leave the touchpad. She clicked through the article, scanning the details: the charity picnic, the fundraiser, his wife's volunteer work, the boys' kindergarten graduation. They were gone now, all of it, and the man who sat in the dark booth at Riverstone Grill had been left behind. She closed the laptop gently, as if any louder motion would disturb the past she'd just witnessed. In the quiet stillness of the kitchen, she wrapped her arms around herself, unsure what to do with everything she had learned. How could a man so capable of such hidden generosity also be capable of cruelty? How could someone who once smiled like that now use silence like a weapon? More importantly, why was he beginning to look at her differently? She stood slowly, her knees stiff from sitting too long, and walked to the sink. She stared out the window at the dark yard, the faint outline of the neighbor's porch light glowing through bare branches. Her breath fogged the glass. She lifted her hand, tracing a small circle in the condensation. She didn't know him, not really. She only knew the shadow version of his life, the parts people whispered about, the parts he buried under wealth and distance. But now she had glimpsed something else, something he didn't show anyone, and the question that had followed her for days returned with new weight. Should she let him know she saw him, or stay silent and pretend she didn't? She didn't know which choice frightened her more. She waited for a quiet moment, then placed his tea on the table with both hands. The cup barely made a sound, but steam curled upward, catching the soft glow of the booth's pendant lamp. The restaurant was unusually calm that night, the kind of calm that made every breath feel loud, every heartbeat amplified. Outside, the winter wind pressed against the windows, sending thin ribbons of frost along the edges of the glass. Grant sat where he always did, coat folded beside him, posture perfectly upright. He didn't look up at first. He rarely did. But Elena didn't step back right away. She lingered, her hands resting lightly on the table's edge, giving herself a second to gather the courage she had been building all week. "Mr. Bellamy," she said quietly. His gaze lifted, slow and deliberate, and settled on her face. The familiar intensity was there, but something else. Something less guarded than before. She drew a breath. "I've been thinking about people who help families after tragedies, people who use what they have to make sure others don't fall through the cracks." His expression didn't change, but she felt the air shift, as though the space between them tightened by a fraction. "They don't ask for credit," she continued softly. "They don't want recognition. They just step in when no one else does." She didn't name him. She didn't need to. The words hung between them like a fragile thread. Grant's fingers stilled on the table. For a moment, he didn't seem to breathe. Elena's heart hammered so loudly she wondered if he could hear it. She hadn't planned to reveal what she'd learned. Not yet. But carrying the knowledge alone had become its own weight, one she couldn't ignore any longer. She didn't look away. She let him see that she knew. His jaw tightened, the smallest movement, barely noticeable. A shadow passed through his eyes. Shock first, then something deeper, darker, like a long sealed door cracking open. A part of her wanted to step back, to apologize, to retreat into the safety of silence. But she stayed. "People like that," she said gently, "don't get enough credit for what they do." Grant's hand curled slightly against the table, a subtle tremor running through the tendons. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough at the edges, stripped of its usual precision. "I don't know what you think you know." "I'm not assuming anything," she said. "I'm just acknowledging that some good in the world happens quietly." His gaze flicked away, toward the window, as if the darkness outside offered him somewhere to hide. He looked almost cornered, not by her judgment, but by the truth he'd spent years burying under stone. Elena felt her breath tremble. Had she pushed too far? Broken some unspoken rule between server and guest? Between two people who shared nothing but tense evenings and sharp edges? She stepped back a fraction. "I'm sorry if I overstepped." His head turned sharply, surprise flashing across his face at her apology. He studied her, eyes narrowing not in anger, but in confusion, like he didn't understand why she, of all people, would meet him with gentleness. The silence extended, and for a moment she wondered if he would leave the restaurant altogether, walk out, shut down, return to the version of himself she had met on her first day. Instead, he looked down at the menu. His fingers traced the edge, slow, thoughtful. "I'll have the salmon," he said. Her brows lifted. "Prepared how?" "Sir." His answer came quiet, almost reluctant. "As the chef makes it." Elena blinked. He had never done that before. Grant always customized everything: temperature, seasoning, sides, plating instructions that made the kitchen groan. His demands were legendary. But now, he surrendered control. Just like that. She nodded slowly. "Of course." She turned to walk toward the service station, but not before her eyes caught the faint shift in his expression. Something unspoken, but undeniably real. He wasn't furious. He wasn't cold. If anything, he looked unsteady, as if her words had struck somewhere he hadn't prepared to defend. In the kitchen, the chef looked up when she relayed the order, straight from the menu. He asked, incredulous. "Yes," she said. He let out a low whistle. "Well, that's a first." Elena didn't answer. Her mind was too full of the photo she'd found, the family he'd lost, the quiet acts of generosity he didn't want anyone to see, and of the way he had looked at her tonight, stunned and unable to hide his reaction. When she carried the plate back to his table later, he wasn't staring out the window anymore. He was watching her approach carefully, intently, as though trying to understand the shape of her thoughts. She set the dish down. His gaze flicked from the plate to her face. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, simple, soft, but they landed deeper than any harshness he'd thrown at her in the past. "You're welcome," she murmured. She stepped away, but her pulse thrummed with an ache she couldn't quite name. Something had shifted like the first crack along the surface of old, unyielding ice. Yet even as hope flickered inside her, uncertainty rose with it. Was this the beginning of change? Or just a moment he would retreat from once the vulnerability passed? The question lingered long after she walked away. The dining room had emptied, but neither of them moved. The last table had been wiped down. The chairs flipped onto their legs with soft thuds, and the kitchen door swung shut for the night. The only light left glowing was the warm pendant above Grant's booth, casting a soft halo around him. Outside, snow feathered down in soft sheets, muffling the world beyond the glass. Elena stood near the edge of the booth, one hand resting on the back of a chair. She should have clocked out 10 minutes ago. She should have been home, helping her father settle in for the evening. But something kept her there, something unspoken, heavy, waiting. Grant's hands were clasped loosely in front of him, untouched tea cooling beside his elbow. He wasn't looking at her, not fully, but he wasn't looking away either. She drew a steady breath. "Mr. Bellamy," she said gently, "I know what you did." His eyes lifted slow, guarded. She didn't mistake the flicker there, not fear of being exposed, but fear of being seen. "For my father," she continued, "the lawyers, the appeal, all of it." He didn't deny it, didn't scoff, didn't turn to stone like she half expected. He only watched her with a stillness that wasn't cold this time, just tired, as if the truth weighed more than he wanted to admit. "Thank you," she said softly. The words felt small compared to what he'd done, but they were all she had. His jaw tightened, not with irritation, something closer to discomfort, raw, unfamiliar, as though gratitude was harder for him to bear than hostility. "You don't need to thank me," he said, voice low. "I do," she replied, "because you didn't have to do any of it." He looked down at his hands. His thumb grazed the knuckle of his left ring finger, a habit she had never noticed before, the ghost of a ring that wasn't there anymore. A long moment passed. Then he spoke, each word deliberate, uneven. "When you were on the phone the other night, I heard enough to know you were out of options." Elena's breath caught, not from shame this time, but from the quiet sincerity beneath his words. "And people," he said, eyes dropping to the table, "deserve better than to be abandoned by the systems that claim to protect them." He didn't say her father's name. He didn't need to. She slid into the booth across from him, not fully, not enough to cross the boundary between them, but close enough to show she was listening. "You help a lot of people," she said carefully, quietly. His shoulders rose in a faint, weary shrug. "It doesn't change anything. It changes their lives," she murmured. She saw him swallow hard, his throat bobbing. For the first time since she'd started working at Riverstone Grill, he looked unsure, not powerful, not untouchable, just human. "My wife," he began, then paused as if the words physically resisted leaving his mouth. She believed in fixing what you can, in showing up for people, even when they don't show up for you. Elena stayed perfectly still. He let out a shaky breath, eyes unfocused as though staring through the table into a place far away. "After they died, people kept telling me to honor their memory. I hate that phrase." His voice tightened. "It sounds like you're making peace with something that should never have happened." He rubbed a hand across his jaw, slow, rough, as if scraping against an old wound. Anger was easier, cleaner. Elena's heart squeezed. She didn't interrupt. It pushed people away. He continued, and when they stayed away, it confirmed what I already believed, that the world didn't care whether I existed or not. She exhaled quietly. "That sounds like a lonely way to live." He didn't deny that either. Silence draped over them again, soft, dim, carrying the faint hum of the heating vents. Elena watched him. The man the staff whispered about. The man who wielded sharpness like armor, sitting across from her, looking like he hadn't slept right in years. She folded her hands gently on the table. "I don't know everything you've been through," she said, "but I do know someone who helps others in secret is not the same man people describe out there." His eyes met hers, startled by the certainty in her voice. "You're more than your anger. Mr. Bellamy," she said softly. "Even if you don't think so." Something inside him flinched. She saw it, a small tightening around his eyes, a breath cut short, as if she had reached a place no one had touched in a long time. "I don't deserve that kind of grace," he murmured, barely audible. "Maybe not," she said with gentle honesty, "but that doesn't mean you don't need it." His breath trembled. He leaned back slightly, as though her words unsettled the ground beneath him. For a man who controlled everything, his meals, his time, his environment, his reputation, loss of footing was its own kind of exposure. Elena could feel the fragility of the moment, the thin line between connection and retreat. She wanted to reach across the table, but she didn't. Boundaries mattered, for him and for her. "Thank you," he said finally. 2 words again, but this time, they sounded like they cost him something to say. She rose slowly. "I should let you go. We're closing." He nodded, though it took him a moment to gather himself enough to stand. When he did, his posture wasn't as rigid as usual. He seemed almost reluctant to leave the soft light of the booth, or maybe reluctant to leave the first honest conversation he'd had in years. As he slipped on his coat, his gaze lingered on her, not piercing, not evaluating, searching. "Elena," he said, her name quiet and unfamiliar on his lips. She lifted her head. He almost spoke. Almost. But whatever he intended to say caught in his throat. Unformed. Instead, he nodded once slow, purposeful, and walked toward the door. She watched his reflection in the glass as he paused outside. Snow gathering on his shoulders, his breath visible in the cold night. What would he do with the first human connection he had allowed in years? She didn't know, but she felt the weight of that question long after he disappeared into the snow. The envelope arrived on a Monday morning, thick and official looking. Elena found it wedged beneath the front mat as she stepped outside to start her car. Frost still clung to the edges of the porch railing, thin and glittering in the early sunlight. Her breath clouded in front of her as she bent down, fingers trembling slightly from the cold and from something else. The return address stopped her heart for a beat. Hollingsworth and Pierce, attorneys at law. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She hadn't expected anything yet. These cases took months, sometimes longer. She stood there with the envelope pressed against her palm, feeling the weight of it real, solid, undeniable, inside the house. Her father coughed from his recliner, the oxygen machine humming softly beside him. She slipped back indoors and sat next to him, the envelope on her lap. The morning light slanted through the window, falling across his weathered hands resting on a fleece blanket. He looked at her with tired, questioning eyes. "What's that?" "Sweetheart, I'm not sure," she whispered, though she was. She tore the top carefully, as if too much force might change the outcome. Several pages slid into her hand, crisp and heavy. As she scanned the first lines, she felt the air leave her lungs. Appeal approved, coverage reinstated, full treatment costs authorized. She covered her mouth, shoulders trembling. Her father's hand found her wrist. "Elena, what does it say?" She read it aloud. Her voice broke halfway through, but she kept going. When she finished, he closed his eyes and leaned back, a long breath escaping him. Relief softened his entire face. "Thank God," he murmured. She nodded, but tears blurred her vision. For the first time in months, she wasn't calculating numbers in her head. She wasn't bracing for the next bill or the next impossible decision. The invisible hand that had been pressing down on her chest finally eased. The house felt lighter. She sat with him until his breathing settled into slow, steady rhythm. He drifted to sleep, his fingers still loosely curled around the edge of the blanket. Elena watched him for a long moment, watched the gentle rise and fall of his chest, and let the relief settle in her bones. Later, as she drove to her evening shift at Riverstone Grill, her windshield wipers brushed aside melting snowflakes. She kept glancing at her phone, half expecting something: an email, a text, a missed call. Nothing came. The restaurant buzzed lightly with early diners, clinking silverware, and the sweetness of warm bread pulled from the oven. Elena hung up her coat and stepped onto the floor, her steps lighter than they had been in months. Marcy, one of the senior servers, noticed immediately. "You look different," she said, tying her apron. "Did something good happen?" Elena offered a small smile. "My dad's coverage got approved." Marcy's face lit with genuine warmth. "Oh, honey, that's wonderful." Elena nodded, holding the moment close. But even as she spoke, her gaze drifted toward the booth where Grant Bellamy usually sat, the corner table with the view of the old river bridge. Empty tonight. The light above it burned quietly, waiting. She felt a soft tug in her chest, an instinct she didn't want to examine too closely. During her break, she stepped outside beneath the awning. The air was cold enough to sting her cheeks. She took out her phone and scrolled again. Still nothing from him. She should have expected that, she supposed. He'd never asked for thanks, never accepted it when she tried. And yet, after everything, after the lawyers and the late-night conversation that had left them both a little undone, she thought he might say something, or at least show up. When she returned inside, the dining room was fuller. Candlelight flickered across polished tabletops. Her mind drifted back to the envelope, the signature at the bottom of the approval notice from the appeals officer. Her family was safe for now. The weight had lifted, and still, a different kind of weight tugged at her heart. During the quiet stretch before closing, she wiped down the bar counter, the motion slow and thoughtful. The memory of Grant leaning across from her in the booth a few nights earlier flickered in her mind, how vulnerable he'd looked when she spoke to him with dignity instead of fear, how he had almost said something at the door before walking away. Did her gratitude frighten him? Did connection feel like betrayal to the loved ones he'd lost? She didn't know. She reached into her apron pocket and touched the folded approval letter she had taken with her, as if keeping it close would make the moment more real. Relief should have been clean, simple, but it wasn't. It came tangled with uncertainty, gratitude, and a quiet ache that surprised her with its depth. At the end of her shift, she lingered in the doorway before stepping outside. Snowflakes drifted lazily around the street lamps, spinning in gentle circles. The sky above Riverstone was muted gray, the kind that swallowed sound and softened everything beneath it. She pulled her coat tighter and walked toward her car. A few steps from the curb, she paused, glancing up and down the street. No black sedan, no familiar silhouette, no sign that he had been there at all. She unlocked the door and slid inside, the interior cold but comforting. Her hands stayed on the steering wheel, unmoving, as she stared at the quiet road in front of her. All this time, she had braced for what he might demand in return. But he asked for nothing, not even acknowledgement, just silence. She rested her forehead against the steering wheel, letting the stillness settle around her. A breath left her, slow and uncertain. Was the story between them over? She didn't know. But the question lingered with her long after she drove away into the softly falling snow. He waited until she clocked out, standing by the side door like a man rehearsing courage. Elena almost didn't see him at first. The snow had let up, leaving the night washed clean, the pavement shining under the glow of the street lamp. She pushed the door open with her hip, tying her scarf, ready to step into the cold when she noticed a figure near the edge of the building. Grant stood perfectly still, hands in the pockets of his dark coat, shoulders slightly hunched as if bracing against more than the weather. She froze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them felt delicate, like the thin layer of ice forming along the gutters. "Evening," he said finally, his voice lower than she remembered. "Evening." Her breath made a small cloud in the air. "I didn't know you were here." "I wasn't," he replied. "Not inside." He swallowed, gaze flicking briefly toward the restaurant windows. "I didn't want to interrupt anything." Something about the way he said that carefully, respectfully sent a subtle tremor through her. She stepped closer, aware of her pulse quickening. "Grant, is everything all right?" He took a breath, long and steady, as though preparing to lift something heavy. "I've been thinking," he began, choosing each word with uncharacteristic restraint, "about what you said, about people who try to do good quietly." His eyes held hers for a moment before drifting downward. "And about what I've been doing with my life since everything changed." The ache beneath those last words pressed into the night air. Elena waited, still, sensing the weight of whatever he carried with him. He reached into his coat and pulled out a slim folder, nothing flashy, just simple leather worn at the edges. He held it out, but not quite toward her, as if offering something sacred. "I'm starting a foundation," he said, "in my family's name, a real one, transparent, accountable, focused on supporting families affected by wrongful injury or systemic failures." His voice softened, "The kind of help I wish someone had given us." Elena's breath hitched. The folder trembled slightly in his hand. He looked at her then, really looked, none of the hardness, none of the cold distance he was known for. His expression was raw in a way she hadn't seen before, as if he were letting her see a part of him that had stayed locked away since the day his life shattered. "I need someone I can trust to run it," he said quietly. "Someone who understands dignity, resilience, someone who doesn't flinch when things are hard." Her heartbeat thudded in her ears. "And you thought of me," she whispered. "I only thought of you," he answered. The honesty in his voice stunned her. For a moment, she couldn't move. The street lamp above them cast pale gold light across his face, softening the lines carved by grief. Snowflakes drifted lazily around them, catching in the edge of his coat collar. She wrapped her arms around herself. "Grant, I'm a waitress." "You're steady," he countered. "You're principled. You see people. You looked me in the eye when no one else would, and not out of fear, but out of conviction." He hesitated before continuing. "You reminded me what it feels like to be treated like a human being." Her throat tightened. He took a small step closer, his voice gentler. "This foundation, I want it built by someone who knows what it means to survive. Elena, someone who has lived through real struggle, not just read about it in reports." Wind brushed past them, carrying the faint scent of winter. She couldn't help it. Her gaze drifted to the folder. Inside could be a new beginning, or a mistake she wasn't ready to make. She thought of her father's treatments now secured, the sudden quiet in her life where constant worry used to be. She thought of the long years spent holding everything together with her bare hands. And she thought of him standing there, offering something he hadn't offered anyone since the day fate took everything from him. "I don't know if I'm qualified," she said softly. "You are," he replied, no hesitation. "What you don't know, you'll learn. What you need, I'll make sure you have." His eyes shone, not with intensity, but with sincerity so deep it felt like a fragile, flickering light being handed to her carefully. "Let me do something that isn't driven by anger. Let me build something that honors them, and maybe helps someone like you." That last line settled into her chest like a warm weight. Elena felt her breath catch. Something inside her, something quiet and long neglected, leaned toward the possibility he was offering. She took the folder from his hand. Her fingers brushed his briefly, a fleeting touch. Barely there, but enough to send a small ripple through her. He didn't flinch. He only watched her with a look she couldn't decipher fully. She opened the folder. A brief proposal, a mission statement, a tentative operating structure. Nothing extravagant, just intention honest and carefully written. Her throat tightened again, but not from fear this time. When she looked up, he waited patient, braced, as if prepared to lose something important. And that, more than anything, told her he wasn't doing this out of control or guilt. He was doing it out of a fragile hope he wasn't sure he deserved. Her voice came out low but steady. "Yes." The word hung between them, warm against the cold air. His eyes widened, not dramatically, just a small, startled shift, as if he hadn't truly believed she would agree. A breath escaped him, the kind a man releases when something inside loosens for the first time in years. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. They stood there in the falling snow, two people who had spent years navigating pain in opposite directions, now standing at the edge of something neither of them had expected. She clutched the folder against her chest. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't look like a narrow hallway. She had to survive. It opened before her, quiet and wide. Still, one question lingered, curling gently at the edges of her thoughts. What does a future shaped by healing look like? Elena stepped out into the evening air. No apron, no shift to rush, to just a quiet road and a horizon that felt wide again. The spring sun had slid low, leaving a soft gold haze over the sidewalk outside the modest office building that now housed the Bellamy family foundation. The glow brushed across her face, warm against the cool breeze rolling off the river. She paused for a moment, letting that warmth settle into her. After years of racing from one obligation to the next, her days finally ended without urgency clinging to her ankles. Inside the building behind her, lights clicked off one by one. She could still hear the faint echo of her new team chatting as they packed up social workers, policy advocates, volunteers, people whose work pulsed with purpose. Her purpose now. She still wasn't used to it, the title, the trust, the sense of direction. Some mornings she woke expecting to grab her apron and hurry to Riverstone Grill, only to remember she no longer served tables but served something far deeper. When she reached her car, she heard footsteps approaching, slow, steady, familiar. Grant walked toward her from across the lot, hands loose at his sides, shoulders no longer burdened by the invisible weight he once carried like armor. He didn't rush, he didn't tense. His pace held a calm she had not seen in him before. "Long day?" he asked, stopping a few feet from her. "A good one," she said, and it was exhausting in a different way, meetings, calls, reviewing cases, but beneath it all lay a sense of meaning that steadied her. He nodded, studying her with quiet satisfaction, as though watching someone rebuild a home from its foundation up. "You handled the Thompson case well," he said. "They needed someone to tell them they weren't alone." "I had good guidance," she replied. He shook his head once. "You had empathy." "That matters more." A passing car sent a stripe of shadow across his face before the light returned, and she noticed how different he looked now, not younger, not untouched by grief, but softened, more present. His eyes, once sharp with guardedness, carried something gentler, a kind of hard-won peace. "How are you?" she asked, because she meant it. He looked up at the horizon before answering. "Learning," he said, It turns out healing isn't one big decision. He exhaled through his nose, almost a quiet laugh, more like 1,000 small ones. She understood. Her life, too, was shifting in small, steady steps. They lingered in the quiet that followed, not uncomfortable, simply real. Neither felt the need to fill it with unnecessary words. That had become part of what made their connection so unusual. Neither asked for more than the other could give. After a moment, Grant reached into a slim bag he carried and pulled out a rectangular object wrapped in brown paper. He held it out with a hint of hesitation. "For you," he said. She blinked. "What is it?" "Just something I thought you should have. A reminder of where all this started." Her pulse sharpened. She accepted the bundle and carefully peeled back the paper. Inside the wrapping was a framed simple oak, smooth to the touch. Behind the glass sat an old, familiar sheet, the Riverstone Grill dinner menu. The exact one she had held the night she refused to bow her head to him, the night she decided dignity mattered more than fear. The paper was slightly creased, one corner softened by time, but it was unmistakable. Her breath trembled. "You kept this," she whispered. He nodded. That night. It was the first time anyone had looked at me without flinching or pitying me. "You didn't treat me like a monster or like a tragedy. Just a man behaving badly who needed to hear a truth he didn't want to hear." Warmth tightened in her chest. He continued, quieter now. "It became a reminder I wasn't proud of who I was, that I needed to change, and that I could." She stared at the frame menu, stunned by how much weight it suddenly carried memory. Pain, defiance, transformation, the start of everything that had come since. "I don't know what to say," she murmured. "You don't have to say anything," he replied. Snowmelt water trickled somewhere nearby. A bird called from the tree above them. Evening settled fully around them, cool but not biting, gentle but not fragile. She lifted her gaze to him. "Grant, does this mean you're ready to leave that version of yourself behind?" He hesitated, thoughtful. "I'm trying," he said. "Some days I slip. Some days the anger comes back. But it doesn't stay as long, and it doesn't own me the way it used to." She nodded slowly. That's enough. She wasn't offering absolution, he didn't ask for that. She was offering recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that change was a road walked, not declared. He exhaled, the breath soft as if easing out of a long-held tension. "You know," he said after a moment, "I never imagined my life would intersect with yours in any meaningful way. Neither did I. And yet, here we are." They exchanged a small, almost shy smile, two people who had endured storms they never expected. Now, standing on calmer ground, Elena adjusted the framed menu against her hip. "I should get home. My dad wants to show me he can walk to the porch again without holding on to the railing." His smile deepened just enough to reach his eyes. "Tell him I'm impressed. I will." She stepped toward her car door, then paused, looking back at him. Grant, yes. She considered him this man who had once weaponized his grief, who now stood before her with steadiness she wouldn't have believed possible months ago. "Do you ever think about what life could look like now?" she asked softly. A breath of wind stirred the hair at his temples. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the question settle between them, as though giving it room to grow roots. "Sometimes," he said finally, "not clearly, not fully, but I think it could be gentler than the one I forced myself to live in." She held his gaze, and in his eyes she saw not certainty, but the first steps of genuine hope. "Good," she whispered. "You deserve that. So do you," he said. She smiled then, warm and small, the kind that reached inward rather than outward. When she finally slid into her car and started the engine, he stayed where he was, watching but not holding her, letting her go, but also letting her return whenever she chose. As she pulled away, the frame menu glanced light across her lap, catching the last gold of the evening sun. Her life felt wider than it had in years, and yet a quiet question stayed with her, gentle and persistent, stretching out like the road before her. Can two people who carried so much pain learn to build gentler lives? She didn't know yet. But for the first time, she believed they might. Sometimes, healing begins where we least expect it, quietly, in the presence of someone who simply refuses to look away. This story reminds us that even the hardest people often carry a softness they no longer know how to show. Anger, distance, sharp words, they're not always signs of cruelty. Sometimes they're shields built by someone who once loved deeply and lost more than they knew how to bear. And sometimes, just being met with steadiness without fear, without pity, can be enough to loosen that armor, one small piece at a time. It also whispers another truth, that dignity matters, even in the smallest moments. The way we stand our ground, the way we choose kindness without surrendering ourselves, those choices shape a life more than we realize. They open doors we never imagined and heal places we thought would stay broken. In the end, two people found gentler paths by simply allowing each other to be human. There's comfort in that, a reminder that even after long seasons of grief or struggle, we are still capable of softening, still capable of beginning again, quietly, bravely, in our own time. Thank you for spending this time with a story tonight. It means more than you know to have you here, listening with an open heart. If you feel this story carried something gentle or true, a like, a share, or a subscribe helps us send a little more kindness into the world. Wishing you peace, warmth, and a soft place to rest your thoughts this evening.